What's up guys, it's LH with Low Tech. We're doing a quick review of the CHUWI Hi10 Plus. This is the 10-inch version of CHUWI's Android and Windows tablet line. There is a Hi8 and as well as a Hi12. And all of them are known for a couple of things, but the biggest thing is going to be that they run both Android and Windows. And it's not something you can really get too much in the US market or even in the European market. From like the big names, it's always gonna be for somebody pretty small, mainly because Microsoft doesn't really want people doing this, but it actually works pretty well. This is a 10.8-inch screen. It's 1920 by 1280, which is a little bit of an unusual resolution. The only ones I've actually ever seen that have this particular resolution would be Microsoft Surface 3, the non-Pro edition, and some of the Nook tablets from Barnes & Noble have them. But on this particular form factor, it works pretty well. There is a pretty noticeable bezel around the edges, but it's not too bad. It does give you a place to hold. It still does have the Windows button here, which some tablets still have them. Not that many ones that are coming out for most computers nowadays, mainly because those are going to be 2-in-1s, as was this is mostly just a laptop. You can get a keyboard for it, but it is sold as a tablet by itself. And on laptops, normally they won't include this button because it's going to be there when you're using it in laptop mode. But it is somewhat useful if you really do like pressing this to get the start menu open. I personally don't like having the button here, especially inside of Android. Where accidentally pressing the home button can be annoying, but some people like it, so it's there. I guess, it's up to you whether or not you actually like that. But overall, it's a pretty nice looking device. It's not the sleekest one, and it is quite heavy. It is actually heavier than my Surface Book tablet, the 13-inch version. It is actually heavier than that is by itself. So it's not something you really want to be using a lot by yourself, like holding it above you, like if you're laying down in bed or something like that, or you're not going to be wanting to holding this tablet above you just because of how heavy it actually is. Another thing would be with the screen, how it is pretty reflective. I'm sure you can see all the different reflections that it goes off to. It is a glass screen, and there actually is a screen protector on it right now. It actually comes with it from the factory, at least in my case it did. You can kind of see a little bit where the screen protector is kind of bubbling out right here. But it does come with a screen protector. If you take that off, it does help the reflections ever so slightly, but in reality, it's just a pretty reflective screen. And a lot of that is to save costs. This is a $200 device, and it does actually have some pretty decent specifications inside of it. It is a Intel Atom X5Z 8350. So it is a slightly faster version than what you get in a lot of the older CHUWI tablets, as well as in many entry-level Windows devices you can get here, such as Toshiba makes one that actually has the same processor inside of it, that is a 2-in-1. It does have 4 GB of RAM, which is great. Windows really needs 4 GB of RAM at the very minimum, so it's good that it actually is included there. And 64 GB of storage. So this was one of the things that I had questions about because it doesn't really list it anywhere, but how much storage is actually included in each of the partitions, because it actually has Windows and Android installed on here on the same hard drive. So you can see it here. There are a couple things installed in here, so you do have a little more space than that to work with right from the beginning. But overall, you do have 45 GB of usable storage in the Windows partition. You're gonna have about 20 plus or so if you actually, from the factory, how it's set up normally. If you were to uninstall some things and kind of whittle it down, you might be able to get a little more out of it, but 45 gigs is what is available to Windows. That does mean the Android side does only have 8 GB available, which is the same as you get in the CHUWI Hi8. which only has 32 gigabytes of internal storage. And it's not that bad, mainly because Android, the apps are going to be smaller. You're usually going to have less of them installed at the same time. But it's still not necessarily a good thing, especially since it only includes Android 5.1 built in and not 6.0. Although hopefully that gets updated sometime soon, because this does run MIIX OS instead of a traditional Android stuff. That is another topic for this video. We're gonna get into it a little bit later, but looking at the hardware itself, the screen, it is really nice in terms of color reproduction. The viewing angles are actually really good on it, other than the the reflectiveness of the screen. But it doesn't get that dim and it doesn't get that bright. This is at full brightness, and you can kind of see it is definitely readable, especially this is in studio lights, but still it's still readable. But if we were to turn the brightness down all the way, that is it all the way turned down to 0%, and that's not that great. To be fair, you are getting this for $200, but it's still not necessarily like you won't be wanting to use this at night as much as some of the other tablets, because it doesn't get as dim. And I'm sure there are some other apps you can use to make it artificially a little more dim, but something to bear in mind. The same thing, if you're gonna be using this outdoors, it's probably not the best tablet for that either. But again, $200 for what you get included. The Asus version of this, or the Toshiba version of this, that actually comes as a full laptop, so with the keyboard, the specs are almost the same, but it goes for an extra $100, and the screen is only 1280 by 800. So overall, this is a much better device. So for the money, this is still a bargain. A couple things though, in terms of hardware, that you will be kind of missing when going to a tablet like this. You'd think for the size, it would actually have full-size USB ports, and it doesn't. It only has the USB-C and a micro USB. We weren't necessarily able to use the USB-C to do that many things unless you have adapters, just because most things don't come with a USB-C plug as of yet. So in the future, it might not be as much of an issue, but for now, if you have a lot of USB 2 stuff, you are not going to be able to use it that much unless you have dongles with you at all times. In terms of performance, it is pretty much in line with what the other Intel Atom processors do. You can see some of the videos where we actually ran benchmarks on here, and for the most part, it falls in line. Light things, basic games, stuff like that inside of Windows will be fine. Internet browsing is actually pretty respectable on here. It's not going to be anything comparable to like an Intel i3, i5, i7, but for the most part, it is going to be at least tolerable for most people to use. Scrolling on it is pretty decent, and this is inside of Chrome, which is what I use. But if you use Microsoft's thing, the scrolling will probably be a little bit smoother, but obviously there's other issues with that too. So, but inside of Chrome, with a number of extensions installed, it does work pretty well. The 4 gigabytes of memory really does help that out here compared to some of the other Intel Atom tablets we had used in the past. So as a Windows device, it is probably much better than what you'd get inside of the CHUWI Hi10, mainly because of its size, but also the extra amount of memory. The speakers on this device, they are stereo speakers, or at least there's 2 of them. They are located right here at the bottom on the sides. There's really two problems with them. The fact that they are very small sounding. This is at 100% volume. It's not that loud. I can't make it go any louder. So that's not gonna, it's not gonna impress anybody, and it's not really loud enough to really use it as a speaker for anything other than, in a quiet environment. I can easily talk over it. It's not that problem for you guys to hear me. The other thing though would be when you're actually holding the device with the buttons up here. So this is the way I would, think that they would want you to hold it, with the camera up top and stuff like that. Your hands can cover up the speakers pretty easily, just because that's where they put them. It would have been much better if they actually put them up here. But yeah, it is what it is. In terms of Chinese tablets, it's actually not the worst I've seen. It's actually better than it is in the Hi10, but the speakers are still pretty bad compared to anything else you'd expect to get in a tablet. There are two cameras, one on the front and one on the back. They're actually identical, despite the fact that one is on a much bigger, looking hole than the other ones. And they're both pretty terrible. It's serviceable in terms of actually doing video chat, although you aren't going to look that great. The front-facing camera doesn't look that great. I mean, it is, definitely usable for things like video chat and stuff like that. But if you're going to go into a darker area that's not, brightly lit, expect the quality to deteriorate. The other thing is that it seems to be somewhat nearsighted, or maybe it's farsighted. Anything that's kind of far away is not going to be very in focus, especially the back camera. So if you're going to be taking pictures of anything, I would recommend using the front camera if you can, but really you shouldn't be using this to take pictures at all. While we're still inside of Windows, let's talk about battery life. And the battery's actually been really good, which is nice, especially when you consider how heavy the device is. We haven't really needed to charge it that much. You can kind of see here in the setting that we are currently kind of doing screen at 100% brightness, which is probably what you're going to be wanting to use, that, or at least 75%. It says 3 hours and 10 minutes left. We've been able to get, easily 5-6 hours out of the battery. So, for a Windows tablet, that's pretty good. In Android, that's a little on the shorter side, but still not that bad. But it's much better than you can get inside of like the Hi10, just because the battery in that device is much smaller, but it's also much lighter. So going into Android, there is an app built inside of it, inside of the Windows partition when you get it, to switch automatically into Android. But what you can do is when you turn the device on, it will give you a menu and you can touch which one you want to go to. But let's go ahead and switch over into Android. One thing I will say about the Hi10 versus the Hi8, at least in the initial weeks that we've had this device, is that it is much more stable than the Hi8 was at this point in time. The Hi8 eventually did become very stable with all the updates and stuff like that. And obviously, this is going to take a bit. The Hi8 did become more stable over time, but initially it did have some issues we mentioned in the review when we did that device. Going into a Windows update, we're going to skip ahead of this because we don't want you to have to watch Windows update. This is where we'll really see the budgetness of this tablet, since it is using eMMC storage as opposed to something like an SSD that you'd get in an expensive tablet, and it's also using an Atom. Things like Windows updates can take a while, just because it has to constantly read and write to the hard drive or to the flash memory, which, if you've ever used flash memory, it does take a toll when it reads and writes at the same time. So things like this will actually take a bit. So we're going to skip ahead and not worry about this for now and show you guys Android. So like we mentioned, for Android, it does run MIIX OS, which is not technically stock Android. The upside of this is it's not something that CHUWI necessarily has to maintain. So as soon as this device is updated by MIIX or Jive, which is the company that actually runs the MIIX OS, then things will automatically get updated, which is good. Which means that we'll have two OSs on here that will at least eventually be, kept pretty current. Windows obviously can be updated whenever, and Android, not actually run by the manufacturer, is pretty well updated as well. I haven't tried forcing MIIX OS 3.0, which is Android Marshmallow, on this device, but according to CHUWI, eventually that is coming out. We'll see how long it takes. It could take a couple months. But this does very much look like an iPad experience inside of Android, just the way it looks. But it also has some flavors of Windows. So you do get things like windows that are, pretty much just like you would get inside of, Mac OS or inside of Windows, which is nice. And in some ways, a lot of the menu system is much easier to use because, you can have it open here on the side. But it can play into some issues when you have apps that are not designed to run inside of Windows modes. I believe this is going to start becoming less and less an issue as Android 7.0 becomes much more prevalent, and having multi-window becomes more of a norm as opposed to a niche thing. But for now, it is a little bit of a blessing and a downside. But there is one other downside that for Remix OS that is, not necessarily something everyone will kind of notice, but we did have issues at one time actually getting into Android stuff, and it's happening again. So one of the downsides with Remix OS is that it doesn't actually come with Google Apps pre-installed normally. It did in our case with this particular device, but things like the Play Store don't come installed. So when you try to open up things like YouTube and etc., some of the Google apps can kind of tend to misbehave if they haven't been updated correctly. So while I can actually watch YouTube videos and it's fine in that respect, it's currently having some issues logging into Remix OS or logging into the Google KPI or API. So that might be something that might be a deal breaker for some people. You might need to mess around with the Android side a little bit more than you're used to, just because it is not a stock Android experience. And you'll have two sets of people saying that, oh, sorry, it's not my issue. But it's not that much different than you'd get if you had a device from Samsung. Samsung would be the one who'd give you support for your Android operating system. But in this case, since it's not technically Android, you can't really ask Google to fix it. It's something that Remix OS has to fix or CHUWI has to fix. So potentially there might be 3 different companies you're having to deal with. But overall, it's worked pretty well for the most part for us. But every once in a while, it hasn't let us log into the Play Store. It might be something we need to erase the Android side and start over again. But even still, that would still be a downside for somebody looking to use this primarily as an Android tablet. But once you get Remix OS working, it is a pretty nice looking interface. You do get some niceties that you don't get to get in stock Android, especially for a tablet. And if you get a mouse hooked up to here, using this on a tablet and with a mouse is a much better experience than stock Android. But overall, guys, it's a pretty good tablet for $200. And if you're okay with it being a little bit heavier of a tablet, and the speakers not being that great, or the screen not being the brightest or the darkest, things like that, all these are, in my mind, pretty small compromises that are made for this device. And for $200, for getting 4 gigabytes of memory, for getting 64 gigabytes of internal storage, there is a micro SD card slot if you wanted to expand that. At least for the Windows side, it shouldn't be an issue. It is a pretty good budget device. If you can go less, if you have to spend less money, there are other options. This is the menu where you can choose between Windows and Android. If you have to spend less money, there are other options, especially if you can go for a smaller size like the Hi10 Pro. This is only an 8-inch device, and you can kind of see the screen is definitely not anywhere near as big as this one's, but it's only $100, so half the price. And in terms of speed, it is pretty close because this is the Z8300 processor. This is only the Z8350. So in terms of processing speed, they're going to be very similar. The only thing you're really losing out on is the extra storage and extra RAM, which may or may not be something that comes into play for you guys, especially if you're using it mostly for Android. But yeah, for $200 for actually having a metal device, for having the ability to get a full-size keyboard, making it into a laptop, it is a very good deal if you actually need those particular feature sets. It is much better than what you can get out of something like a Nextbook, mainly because of the screen. The screen resolution is really what sold this device to me. Anything sub 1080p is kind of a deal breaker. And the fact that this one is an even taller, so I believe it's 3x2 as opposed to 16x9 or even 16x10. It does make this a much more usable device, especially if you're going to be using it in portrait mode, which is actually not necessarily a bad idea, because that would put the speakers here and here as opposed to right underneath your fingers. So for $200, I would buy it. I would definitely recommend it if you can spend it over the Hi8, but it's all depending on if these particular features, the upgrades over the Hi8, are actually worth it to you. Especially if we can get remix OS 3.0 on here, I think that would solve a lot of the problems that we were having with remix OS 2.0. Thanks for watching, guys. This is LOH Low Tech, and this is the CHUWI Hi10 Plus. Subscribe.